The dust had been their constant companion for 3 weeks, settling into every crevice of the wagon, coating her children's faces, and turning the endless prairie into a blur of brown and gold that stretched from horizon to horizon. Margaret Emerson gripped the reins tighter as another wheel hit a rut in the trail, sending a jolt through her weary body while her 2 children huddled in the back among their meager possessions. She had no idea where she was going, only that she couldn't go back to what remained of the life she'd left behind in Missouri. 7-year-old Sarah shifted behind her, trying to comfort her younger brother Thomas, who at 5 years old had grown tired of asking when they would stop moving. Margaret's husband James had been dead for 4 months now, taken by fever that swept through their settlement with cruel efficiency. The bank had wasted no time claiming their small farm, leaving her with nothing but this wagon, 2 horses that were growing thinner by the day, and the clothes on their backs. The sun was climbing higher in the Wyoming sky when she saw the fence line. It seemed to go on forever, sturdy posts connected by tight wire that spoke of wealth and purpose. Her heart sank a little. Wealthy ranchers had no use for a widow with 2 small children and no money. She'd learned that lesson several times already on this journey west. Then she saw him, sitting tall on a chestnut horse that gleamed even in the harsh morning light. He was watching her wagon approach with the stillness of a man who had all the time in the world. As she drew closer, she could make out more details. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His clothes were work-worn but well-made, and he sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. Margaret pulled her wagon to a stop, suddenly aware of how she must look. Her dress was stained with dust and sweat, her blonde hair had escaped its pins days ago, and she probably looked half wild. But she lifted her chin anyway, meeting his gaze with as much dignity as she could muster. "Morning, madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and steady with a warmth that surprised her. "You look like you've been traveling a while." "We have," she said simply. There was no point in pretending otherwise. He glanced at the wagon, then back at her face. "Where are you headed?" "West," she said, then amended honestly. "I'm not entirely sure. Somewhere we can make a new start." "There's not much west of here for a good 100 miles except open range and trouble," he said matter-of-factly. "How long since you've had a proper meal?" "You or the children?" Margaret felt her cheeks burn. Pride made her want to lie, but the truth must have been written all over her face and in the hollow eyes of her children. "A few days," she admitted quietly. The man studied her for a long moment, and she braced herself for dismissal or worse, pity. Instead, he said something that made her breath catch in her throat. "I'm Russell Lawson. I own this ranch, the Double L. It's just me and my foreman and a handful of hands, and we could use help. Someone who can cook, keep the house, maybe tend a garden. You'll have a home by sundown if you want it. Separate quarters, good wages, and meals for all of you." Margaret stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you've got 2 children to feed and winter's coming on," Russell said simply. "I know you've got the grit to make it this far on your own. That tells me plenty. The question is whether you're willing to take a chance on a job and a roof over your head." She looked back at Sarah and Thomas, saw the hope dawning in their tired faces, and knew she had no real choice. But more than that, something in Russell Lawson's steady gaze made her want to trust him. "I'm Margaret Emerson. These are my children, Sarah and Thomas. We'd be grateful for the work and a place to stay." "Then follow me," Russell said, turning his horse. "It's about 2 miles up this road." The ranch house came into view gradually, rising out of the prairie like something from a dream. It was larger than Margaret had expected. a two-story structure of wood and stone with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. Behind it stood a barn, corrals, and several smaller buildings. Cattle dotted the landscape as far as she could see, their red and white bodies moving slowly across the grassland. Russell led her to a small house set apart from the main building, with its own porch and a view of the mountains in the distance. This was supposed to be for a foreman who never came, he explained as he helped her down from the wagon. His hands were strong and calloused, and he released her the moment her feet touched the ground, respecting the proper distance. It's got 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a good stove. I'll have the boys bring wood and water, and you can get settled. When you're ready, come up to the main house and we'll talk about meals and such. Margaret climbed the steps on trembling legs and pushed open the door. The interior was simple but clean, with real glass windows and wooden floors. There was furniture, basic but solid, and the stove Russell had mentioned looked nearly new. She turned to find him carrying Thomas in one arm while Sarah clung to his hand, chattering away about the cattle she'd seen. "Thank you," Margaret said, and her voice cracked despite her best efforts. "You don't know what this means to us." Russell set Thomas down gently and met her eyes. "Everyone needs help sometimes, Mrs. Emerson. No shame in that. You get your young ones settled and I'll send someone over with supplies. Take today to rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to talk about work." He left before she could say anything else, his long strides carrying him back toward the main house. Margaret stood in the doorway of their new home and felt tears sliding down her cheeks for the first time since James had died. But these were different tears, tears of relief and something that felt dangerously close to hope. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. A young cowhand named Billy arrived with his arms full of provisions: flour, sugar, coffee, bacon, beans, and even fresh eggs. He was followed by another man who introduced himself as Tom Bailey, the foreman, a grizzled individual in his 50s with kind eyes and a weather-beaten face. "Boss says to tell you there's no rush on anything," Tom said as he helped carry in her belongings from the wagon. "But when you're ready, the main house could use a woman's touch. We've been making do with our own cooking for near about 2 years now, and it shows." That evening, Margaret cooked the first real meal they'd had in weeks. The children ate until they couldn't hold another bite, then fell asleep almost immediately in the clean beds of their new room. Margaret sat alone in the kitchen, drinking coffee and trying to understand the strange turn her life had taken. Through the window, she could see lights in the main house. She wondered about Russell Lawson, about what kind of man offered help to a stranger without asking for anything in return. She'd met enough men in her 26 years to know that kindness often came with expectations. But something about the way he'd looked at her children, the gentleness in his hands when he'd carried Thomas, spoke of genuine decency. The next morning, Margaret woke with the sun and dressed in her least worn dress. She braided her hair carefully and told Sarah to watch Thomas while she went to the main house. Her heart pounded as she climbed the porch steps and knocked on the heavy wooden door. Russell answered it himself, looking startled to see her. "Mrs. Emerson, you didn't need to come so early." "I wanted to earn my keep," she said firmly. "You mentioned cooking and housekeeping. I'd like to start today if that suits you." He stepped back to let her in, and Margaret got her first look at the interior of the ranch house. It was spacious and well-built, but Tom had been right. The place had the unmistakable stamp of men living alone. Dishes were piled in the kitchen, dust covered most surfaces, and the whole house had an air of neglect. "My wife died 2 years ago," Russell said quietly, following her gaze. "Cancer took her quick. We haven't quite managed to keep things up since then." "I'm sorry for your loss," Margaret said, meaning it. She understood the weight of that kind of grief. "And I'm sorry for yours," he replied. "Tom mentioned you're widowed." "4 months now," she said. "Fever." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two people bound by loss and circumstance. Then Russell cleared his throat. "The kitchen's through here. I usually have breakfast around 6. The hands eat at 6:30. Lunch is at noon, dinner at 7. If that's too much, we can work something else out." "That will be fine," Margaret said. "I'll need to bring the children with me sometimes, especially at first." "That's not a problem," Russell said immediately. "They can play in the yard, or there's a room upstairs that used to be a nursery. They'd be welcome to use it." Over the following days, Margaret fell into a rhythm. She woke before dawn and made her way to the main house, where she prepared breakfast for Russell and the ranch hands. The men were polite and grateful, often commenting that they hadn't eaten so well in years. After breakfast, she would clean while Sarah and Thomas explored their new surroundings under the watchful eye of whoever was working near the house. Russell was often gone during the day, riding out to check on the cattle, or mend fences, or do any of the 1,000 tasks that kept a ranch running. But in the evenings, he would return to the house and they would talk while she prepared dinner. At first, the conversations were stilted and formal, but gradually they began to relax into something more natural. She learned that Russell had built this ranch from nothing, starting with a small herd and a dream when he was barely 20 years old. He'd married young, to a woman named Catherine who'd loved the ranch as much as he did. They'd planned on children, but Catherine had gotten sick before that could happen. "Some days I wonder why I keep at it," Russell admitted one evening as he sat at the kitchen table while Margaret kneaded bread dough. "It's a lot of house for one man." "It's a beautiful ranch," Margaret said carefully. "You've built something to be proud of." "Maybe," he said. "But a ranch is supposed to be a legacy, something you pass down. Without family, it's just property." Margaret didn't know what to say to that, so she focused on her bread. But she found herself thinking about his words long after she'd returned to her own house that night. As September turned into October, the weather began to change. The air grew crisper, and the leaves on the few trees near the creek turned gold and red. Margaret had never been happier or more content. The children were thriving, putting on weight and regaining the carefree nature that had been lost during their difficult journey. Sarah had started learning her letters from Tom, who turned out to have a surprising amount of education for a ranch foreman. Thomas had attached himself to Billy, following the young cowhand around and learning about horses and cattle. And Margaret found herself looking forward to her time with Russell more than she cared to admit. He was unlike any man she'd known. James had been a good husband, but he'd been simple and straightforward, with little interest in anything beyond his farm and his family. Russell was different. He read books, had opinions on politics and progress, and treated her like someone whose thoughts mattered. One evening in late October, a storm rolled in without warning. Margaret was in the main house preparing dinner when the first drops began to fall. Within minutes, it had turned into a deluge, rain hammering against the windows and wind howling around the corners of the house. "You can't go back to your place in this," Russell said, appearing in the kitchen doorway. "You and the children should stay here tonight." "The children are at the house already," Margaret said, worry sharp in her voice. "Sarah's watching Thomas." "I'll send Billy over to check on them and bring them here," Russell said immediately. "They'll be safer in this solid house anyway." Billy returned 20 minutes later, soaked to the skin but with both children wrapped in oilcloth. Sarah was trying to be brave, but Margaret could see the fear in her daughter's eyes. Thomas was crying and she scooped him up immediately, holding him close. "There's rooms upstairs," Russell said. "Second and third doors on the left. Get the children dry and settled. I'll finish dinner." "You can't cook," Margaret protested. "I managed before you came," he said with a slight smile. "I can manage one meal. Go take care of your children." The storm raged all night. Margaret got the children into dry clothes borrowed from storage and settled them in one of the upstairs bedrooms. It was beautifully furnished, with a large bed and thick quilts. Sarah and Thomas huddled together under the covers while Margaret sat beside them, stroking their hair and singing softly until they fell asleep. When she came back downstairs, she found Russell standing by the window, watching the storm. He'd made a simple meal of beans and bacon, and 2 plates sat on the table. "They asleep?" he asked without turning around. "Yes, finally. Thank you for sending Billy. I should have left earlier." "You couldn't have known the storm would come on so fast," Russell said. He turned to face her, and in the lamplight, Margaret was struck by how handsome he was. It wasn't something she'd let herself think about before, but alone with him in the quiet house, it was impossible to ignore. "Come eat. You must be exhausted." They sat across from each other at the table, the storm a distant roar beyond the walls. The food was surprisingly good, and Margaret said so. Russell smiled. "I'm not completely helpless, just prefer not to cook when I can help it." "You've been very kind to us," Margaret said softly. "I want you to know how much I appreciate it, not just the job and the house, but everything. The way you've treated my children, the respect you've shown me, it means more than you know." Russell set down his fork and looked at her directly. "Margaret, I'm going to be honest with you. When I first saw you on that road, I told myself I was just helping someone in need. That's what good people do, but that's not the whole truth anymore." Margaret's heart began to pound. "What do you mean?" "I mean that having you here, having your children here, has made this house feel like a home again," he said. His voice was low and intense. "I know it hasn't been long. I know you're still grieving your husband, and I'm not trying to rush you or make you uncomfortable. But I need you to know that my feelings have become more than just those of an employer. I care about you, Margaret, about all of you." She should have been shocked, should have reminded him of propriety and proper mourning periods. But instead, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the food or the fire. "I care about you too," she heard herself say. "I've been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was just gratitude or relief at having security again, but it's more than that. When I'm with you, I feel like myself again, like I'm more than just a widow trying to survive." Russell reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against hers. "I don't want to dishonor your husband's memory or rush you into anything. But I want you to know that my intentions are honorable. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd like to court you properly." "I think I'd like that," Margaret whispered. They sat holding hands across the table while the storm raged outside, and Margaret felt something shift inside her. The grief she'd been carrying began to make room for something new, something bright and hopeful that she'd never expected to feel again. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having passed in the night. Margaret woke in one of the guest rooms where Russell had insisted she sleep, and for a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then it all came back. The storm, the conversation, the feeling of Russell's hand in hers. She found him in the kitchen already, making coffee. He looked up when she entered and smiled, and that smile made her feel like a girl again instead of a widow with 2 children and a lifetime of hard work behind her. "Good morning," he said. "I thought I'd get started on breakfast, but I'm not sure I'm up to your standards." "Let me help," Margaret said, moving to stand beside him at the stove. They worked together in comfortable silence, and when their hands brushed reaching for the same pan, they both smiled. The children came down soon after, and they all ate breakfast together like a family. Sarah and Thomas chattered about the storm, and Russell listened with genuine interest, asking questions and making them laugh. Watching him with her children, Margaret felt her heart opening wider. Over the following weeks, Russell courted her in the old-fashioned way. He would walk with her in the evenings after the children were in bed, talking about everything and nothing. He brought her small gifts, a book of poetry, a new shawl, ribbons for Sarah's hair. He was always respectful, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but making his feelings clear through every action. The ranch hands noticed, of course. Tom Bailey approached Margaret one afternoon while she was hanging laundry. "Mrs. Emerson, I hope you don't mind me speaking plainly," he said, turning his hat in his hands. "Of course not, Tom. The boss, he's a good man. Best I've ever worked for. He was broken when Miss Catherine died, just going through the motions of living. But since you came, he's different. Got his spark back. I just wanted you to know that whatever happens between you two, the boys and I, we're happy for it." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Tom. That means a great deal." Winter came to Wyoming with a vengeance. Snow began falling in November and didn't stop. Margaret and the children moved into the main house at Russell's insistence, taking up residence in the guest rooms. It was more practical, he argued, and safer for everyone. Margaret knew it was also because he wanted them close, and she couldn't deny that she wanted the same thing. They fell into domesticity like they'd been doing it all their lives. Russell taught Thomas to whittle in the evenings while Margaret and Sarah worked on sewing projects. They played cards and read aloud from books. On Sundays, Russell would hitch up the sleigh and take them all into Rawhide, the nearest town, for church services and supplies. It was on one of those Sunday trips that Russell asked Margaret to marry him. They were alone in the general store while the children were with Tom picking out peppermint sticks. Russell had been quiet all morning, and Margaret had sensed something was weighing on his mind. "Margaret," he said suddenly, stopping in the middle of the aisle. "I know we haven't been courting long by normal standards, but I'm 32 years old and I know my own mind. I love you. I love Sarah and Thomas like they were my own. I want to make this official, make you my wife and them my children-in-law if not in blood. Will you marry me?" Margaret looked at this good, strong man who had given her and her children everything when they had nothing. But more than that, she looked at the man she'd come to love with her whole heart, the man who made her laugh and challenged her mind and treated her like she was precious. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Russell pulled her into his arms right there in the general store, and Margaret didn't care who saw. When he kissed her, gentle and sweet, she felt like she was coming home. They were married in January 1887, in the small church in Rawhide with Tom and the ranch hands in attendance. Sarah was the flower girl, beaming with pride in a new dress Margaret had made. Thomas stood with Russell, serious and important in his role as ring-bearer. Margaret wore a simple dress of blue wool that Russell had commissioned from the dressmaker in town. It wasn't fancy, but when Russell saw her walking down the aisle, the look in his eyes made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. The preacher spoke about love and commitment, about the joining of two families into one. When Russell slipped the gold band onto her finger and promised to love and cherish her all the days of his life, Margaret believed him with everything in her. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with food and music and dancing. The ranch hands had decorated the house with evergreen boughs and ribbon, and someone had brought a fiddle. Russell danced with Margaret, then with Sarah, then swept Thomas up and spun him around until the boy was dizzy with laughter. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Russell carried Margaret over the threshold of their bedroom. He set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "More than I ever thought I could be again," Margaret answered honestly. "You've given me and my children everything, Russell. A home, security, love. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You already have," he said, kissing her forehead. "You've made this house a home again. You've given me a family and a future. That's worth more than all the cattle in Wyoming." Their wedding night was tender and sweet, and Margaret discovered that love the second time around could be just as powerful as the first, perhaps more so, because it was tempered with gratitude and appreciation for how precious and fragile happiness could be. Life on the Double L Ranch settled into a new rhythm. Margaret was no longer the housekeeper but the lady of the house, Russell's wife and partner in all things. She worked alongside him in making decisions about the ranch, and he valued her opinion on everything from which cattle to sell to how to handle disputes among the hands. Sarah and Thomas called Russell Papa now, and he loved them fiercely. He taught them both to ride, sitting patiently while they learned to handle the gentle mare he'd bought specifically for them. He helped Sarah with her schoolwork and played endless games with Thomas in the evenings. Spring came to Wyoming in a rush of green grass and wildflowers. Margaret planted a garden behind the house, with vegetables and herbs and flowers for the table. She joined the ladies' social circle in Rawhide, making friends with the other ranch wives and town women. But her favorite moments were still the quiet evenings at home with Russell and the children. In May, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but wanted to be sure before she told Russell. When she finally shared the news, he picked her up and spun her around, whooping with joy. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Margaret asked, suddenly worried. "I know Sarah and Thomas are yours in every way that matters." "I'm thrilled," Russell said firmly. "I love Sarah and Thomas like my own blood, and I always will. But the idea of a child that's part you and part me, created from our love, that's something special too. There's room in my heart for all of them." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months. Margaret bloomed, growing round and healthy on the good food and easy life at the ranch. Russell was attentive to the point of being overprotective, insisting she rest more and work less. Sarah and Thomas were excited about the baby, already making plans for how they would help care for their new sibling. In late September 1887, as the leaves were turning gold again, Margaret went into labor. Russell sent Billy racing to town for the doctor while Tom's wife Emma, who had experience with birthing, came to help. The labor was long but not difficult, and as the sun was setting, Margaret delivered a healthy baby boy. Russell wept when he held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he looked at the tiny red face and perfect little fingers. "He's beautiful," he whispered. "You're beautiful. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for everything." They named him Robert James Lawson, honoring both Russell and Margaret's first husband. Sarah and Thomas were allowed in to meet their new brother, and they stared at him with awe and wonder. "He's so small," Sarah whispered, gently touching Robert's tiny hand. "You were that small once," Margaret said, smiling. "Both of you were." "Can we keep him?" Thomas asked seriously, and everyone laughed. "Yes, sweetheart," Russell said, pulling Thomas onto his lap while still cradling the baby. "We're definitely keeping him." The months that followed were challenging in the way that new babies always are, full of sleepless nights and constant feeding, but they were also magical. Russell was a devoted father, taking turns walking the floor with Robert when he cried, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours just watching his son sleep. Margaret loved seeing him with all three children. He made no distinction between Sarah and Thomas, who were hers from before, and Robert, who was theirs together. They were all simply his children, and he loved them all equally and fiercely. By the time Robert was 6 months old, the ranch was thriving more than ever. Russell had expanded the herd and hired more hands. The house was full of life and laughter, a far cry from the lonely, neglected place Margaret had first seen. One evening in March 1888, after the children were all asleep, Margaret and Russell sat together on the porch swing, wrapped in blankets against the cold. The stars were brilliant in the clear sky, and the only sound was the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. "Do you ever think about that day we met?" Russell asked, his arm around Margaret's shoulders. "All the time," Margaret admitted. "I was so lost, so scared. I had no idea where we were going or how we'd survive. I saw you coming down that road and something just told me to stop," Russell said. "I can't explain it. I'd seen plenty of travelers before, but something about you was different. And when I talked to you, when I saw the strength in you despite everything you'd been through, I knew I had to help. You said I'd have a home by sundown," Margaret remembered. "And you kept that promise. But you gave me so much more than a home, Russell. You gave me a life, a family, love. You gave me back my future." "We gave each other that," Russell said, kissing the top of her head. "I was just existing before you came, going through the motions. You reminded me what it meant to really live, to hope and dream again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Russell said, "I want to expand the house, add on a few more bedrooms." Margaret looked up at him with a smile. "Are you planning on more children, Mr. Lawson?" "If God blesses us with them, I'd be honored," Russell said seriously. "But even if not, I want this house to be ready for grandchildren someday. I want the Double L to be a place where family gathers, where there's always room for one more." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Margaret said softly. Over the next few years, the ranch and the family both grew. The addition to the house was completed, adding 4 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. In 1889, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Ruth Catherine Lawson, honoring Russell's late wife. Catherine would have wanted Russell to be happy, and Margaret felt no jealousy in keeping her memory alive. In 1891, another son arrived, Samuel Thomas, and the house rang with the sounds of 5 children growing and playing and learning. Sarah, now 13, was a tremendous help with the younger ones. Thomas, at 11, worked alongside Russell and the ranch hands, learning the cattle business from the ground up. Russell formally adopted Sarah and Thomas in 1890, making them Lawsons in law as well as in love. The day the papers were signed, they had a family celebration, and Russell presented both children with silver lockets engraved with their new name. "You've been mine in my heart since the day I met you," he told them. "But now it's official. You're Lawsons, and this ranch will be yours someday too, along with your brothers and sister." The years passed with the kind of happy busyness that comes from a full house and a working ranch. There were challenges, of course. Harsh winters, cattle diseases, market downturns. But Russell and Margaret faced them all together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle they overcame. Margaret became known throughout the county as a gracious hostess and a generous friend. She organized church socials, helped new settlers get established, and always had room at her table for anyone who needed a meal. The Double L Ranch became known as a place of hospitality and warmth. Russell's reputation grew as well. He was known as a fair employer and an honest dealer. Other ranchers sought his advice, and he was elected to the Territorial Council in 1892, representing the interests of ranchers throughout the region. But despite their growing prominence, the family remained grounded in the simple pleasures of ranch life. Russell still taught all the children to ride and rope. Margaret still made bread from scratch and tended her garden. On Sunday evenings, they would all gather in the parlor, the children sprawled on the floor while Russell read aloud from whatever book they were working through. Sarah married in 1895 at 18 to a young rancher named David Morrison who had courted her properly and won both her heart and Russell's approval. The wedding was held at the ranch, with what seemed like half of Wyoming in attendance. Margaret cried as she watched her daughter walk down the aisle, remembering the frightened 7-year-old who'd huddled in the back of a wagon, not knowing where her next meal would come from. Thomas went to university in 1897, studying animal husbandry with the intention of returning to help run the Double L. Russell was enormously proud, insisting on paying for everything despite Thomas's protests that he could work his way through. "You're my son," Russell said firmly. "And a father's privilege is helping his children succeed. Let me have this." Robert and Samuel were growing into fine young men. Ruth was a bright and cheerful girl of 8, and in 1899, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again at 39 years old. She thought her childbearing years were over, but Russell was delighted. "Another blessing," he said, cradling her face in his hands. "We're going to need that addition we talked about making even bigger." This pregnancy was harder than the others, and the doctor insisted Margaret rest more. Russell hired extra help for the house and fussed over her constantly. Sarah, now a mother herself, came to help in the final months. In November 1899, as the 19th century drew to a close, Margaret delivered twin girls. The birth was difficult, and for a few frightening hours the doctor worried they might lose her. But Margaret was strong, strengthened by years of good food and love and purpose, and she pulled through. Russell named the twins Grace and Hope, because that's what they represented to him. When Margaret was strong enough, he brought all 7 of their children into the bedroom to meet their new sisters. "This is our family," he said, his voice thick with emotion. 7 beautiful children and a wife who's the strongest, most amazing woman I've ever known. I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming." "We're all lucky," Sarah said softly, looking around at her siblings. "We're lucky to have each other, to have this place, to have parents who love us so much." Margaret looked at Russell, met his eyes across the crowded room, and smiled. She thought back to that desperate woman in a wagon, with 2 hungry children and no hope. She'd never imagined this life, never dreamed she could be so happy or so blessed. The 20th century arrived with celebration throughout the county. The Double L hosted a huge party with neighbors coming from miles around. There was music and dancing and food enough to feed an army. As midnight approached, Russell pulled Margaret out onto the porch, away from the noise and celebration. 20 years, he said softly. "Well, almost. We met in 1886, married in 1887. It's hard to believe so much time has passed." "The best 20 years of my life," Margaret said, leaning into him. "Even counting the sleepless nights and the worry and the hard times, it's all been worth it." "I love you, Margaret Lawson," Russell said, tilting her chin up so he could see her face in the starlight. "I loved you when I first saw you in that wagon, though I didn't know it yet. I've loved you every day since, and I'll love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Margaret whispered. "You saved me, Russell. You saved my children, and then you gave us a life beyond anything I could have imagined." "We saved each other," Russell corrected. "I was dying inside when you came, just going through the motions. You brought me back to life." They kissed as the bells rang midnight, welcoming the new century, and inside the house, their children cheered and celebrated. This was their legacy, Russell thought. Not just the ranch or the land or the cattle, but this family they'd built together. Children who knew they were loved, who would carry forward the values of hard work and compassion, and always making room for one more at the table. The years continued to unfold in patterns of seasons and growth. Thomas returned from university in 1901, and began taking on more responsibility for the ranch. He had innovative ideas about breeding and range management that Russell was happy to implement. Father and son worked side by side, and Russell felt deep satisfaction in knowing the Double L would continue to thrive under Thomas's eventual leadership. Robert and Samuel were proving themselves capable ranchers as well, though Robert showed interest in the business side while Samuel loved the hands-on work with the cattle and horses. Ruth was a gifted student, and Russell was already making plans to send her to a teacher's college when she was old enough. The twins, Grace and Hope, were terrors in the best possible way, keeping the entire household on their toes with their mischief and energy. At 5 years old, they were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and getting into twice the trouble of a single child. Sarah had 3 children of her own now, and she brought them to visit often. Margaret loved being a grandmother, loved watching Russell with his grandchildren. He was patient and playful, getting down on the floor to play whatever games they invented, reading stories in funny voices, teaching them the same things he'd taught their mother. One afternoon in the summer of 1904, Margaret was working in her garden when Russell came to find her. He'd been in Rawhide on business and he had a strange look on his face. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, brushing dirt from her hands. "Nothing's wrong," he said quickly. "But I met someone in town, a woman traveling alone with 3 children trying to get to Oregon. She looked lost and desperate, and it reminded me of someone." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "What did you do?" "I offered her a job," Russell said. "Tom's been saying he wants to retire soon, spend more time with his grandchildren. His house will be empty, and this woman, her name is Helen, she's in the same situation you were in. Widowed, no money, just trying to survive. I thought we could help." Margaret threw her arms around him. "You're a good man, Russell Lawson, the best man I've ever known." "I learned from the best," he said, holding her close. "You've never turned away anyone who needed help. You've made this ranch a place where people know they can find kindness. I'm just following your example." And so the pattern continued, the Double L becoming known as a place where those in need could find help and hope. Some stayed permanently, like Helen, who became Margaret's dear friend and helped manage the household. Others stayed only briefly, resting and resupplying before moving on. But all of them left better than they arrived, carrying with them the knowledge that there was still goodness in the world. In 1910, Russell and Margaret celebrated their 23rd wedding anniversary. Thomas was married now, with children of his own living in the expanded house. Robert was courting a girl from Rawhide, and Samuel had announced his intention to start his own spread on the far edge of the Double L property, with Russell's blessing and financial backing. Ruth, at 18, was teaching at the school in Rawhide while living at home. The twins, Grace and Hope, were 11 years old and showing every sign of being as strong and capable as their mother. The house was always full, always noisy, always alive with the sounds of family. Margaret moved through it with contentment in her heart, grateful every single day for the life she'd been given. One evening, as she and Russell sat on their favorite porch swing watching the sunset, he took her hand and said, "Tell me the truth. Have you been happy?" "Blissfully," Margaret said without hesitation. "I never imagined I could be this happy, Russell. You've given me everything." "We've given each other everything," he corrected. "That's what marriage is, what family is. It's giving and receiving in equal measure, building something together that's greater than what either of you could build alone." "When you said I'd have a home by sundown that day, did you have any idea it would turn into all this?" Margaret asked, gesturing at the ranch spread out before them. "No," Russell admitted. "I thought I was offering a housekeeper job and a safe place to land. I had no idea I was meeting the woman who would change my entire life, who would give me a family and a purpose, and a love that would sustain me through everything. I was so scared that day, Margaret remembered. So tired and desperate and terrified of what would happen to Sarah and Thomas. And then you appeared like something out of a dream and offered us salvation. You saved yourself, Russell said firmly. You had the courage to accept help, to take a chance on a stranger. You had the strength to build a new life. I just provided the location. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. 38 years had passed since that day on the prairie, and every one of those years had been a gift. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of their family preparing for dinner. Thomas's children were laughing about something, and Ruth was playing the piano Margaret had insisted Russell buy years ago. The twins were arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to set the table. "This is what heaven must be like," Margaret said softly. "Surrounded by the people you love, in a place you've built with your own hands and heart, knowing that the legacy you're leaving is one of love and kindness." "If this isn't heaven, it's close enough for me," Russell agreed. They went inside together, hand in hand, to join their family for dinner. The long table was crowded with children and grandchildren, and the noise level was remarkable. Margaret looked around at all the faces she loved and felt her heart might burst with happiness. After dinner, as had become tradition, the family gathered in the parlor. Russell sat in his favorite chair with the youngest grandchildren on his lap, while Thomas took out his guitar. They sang old songs and new ones, hymns and ballads and silly tunes that made the children giggle. Margaret sat watching them all, these people who had become her whole world. Sarah, her firstborn, now a confident woman and mother. Thomas, who'd grown from a frightened 5-year-old into a capable man who would inherit the ranch someday. Robert, Samuel, Ruth, Grace, and Hope, all of them carrying forward the values she and Russell had instilled. When the evening was winding down and the grandchildren were being bundled up to go home, Sarah pulled Margaret aside. "Mama, I want to tell you something," she said softly. "I don't remember much about my father, my birth father. I was so young when he died. But I remember being afraid all the time, remember not knowing if we'd eat or where we'd sleep. And then Papa Russell appeared and everything changed. You gave us such a beautiful life, both of you. Thank you." Margaret hugged her daughter tightly. "Your father would be proud of the woman you've become, and Russell is proud too. We both are." The years continued their steady march. In 1915, the ranch celebrated its 30th anniversary, and half the county showed up for the party. Russell was 63 now, his dark hair liberally streaked with gray. But he was still strong and vital, still capable of a full day's work. Margaret was 55, and though time had left its mark in the lines around her eyes and the silver in her hair, she was still beautiful. More than that, she carried herself with the confidence and grace of a woman who knew her own worth and purpose. They had 14 grandchildren now, with more on the way. The Double L had expanded to nearly twice its original size, and it was one of the most successful ranches in Wyoming. But more than the material success, it was known as a place of integrity and kindness, where a person's word was their bond, and a helping hand was always extended to those in need. In the spring of 1918, as the world was torn apart by war overseas, the ranch was a haven of peace and stability. They did their part, of course, sending money and supplies, and Samuel enlisted despite his parents' fears. But on the ranch itself, life continued in its steady rhythms. Russell and Margaret took more time for themselves now, letting Thomas and Robert handle more of the daily operations. They would take long rides together across the land they both loved, stopping by their favorite spots to watch the cattle graze or simply to enjoy the vast Wyoming sky. "You have any regrets?" Russell asked her one day as they sat by the creek where he'd taught all their children to fish. "None," Margaret said honestly. "I've lived a life beyond my wildest dreams. I've loved and been loved. I've raised children who are good people. I've built something lasting. What could I possibly regret?" "I regret that I didn't meet you sooner," Russell said. "That we didn't have more years together." "We've had 31 years," Margaret pointed out, "and God willing, we'll have many more. Besides, maybe we needed the experiences we had before we met. Maybe that's what made us ready for each other." "Always the wise one," Russell said, kissing her hand. "I love you, Margaret, more today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "I love you too," she said. "My rancher who promised me a home by sundown and gave me the world." In 1920, they celebrated their 33rd wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner, just the two of them. The children had offered to throw a party, but Russell and Margaret preferred the intimacy of being alone together. 33 years, Margaret marveled. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've always been together." "I know exactly what you mean," Russell said. "I can barely remember what life was like before you." "Lonely," Margaret said. "For both of us. We were both so lonely, even surrounded by people. And then we found each other, and everything made sense." "You made sense of my whole life," Russell agreed. "You showed me that it's never too late to start over, to find happiness again, to build something beautiful from the ruins of what was lost." They were in their 70s now, both of them, though neither felt old in spirit. They moved slower perhaps, rested more, but their love was as strong as ever, perhaps stronger for having weathered decades of life together. In 1925, they celebrated the ranch's 40th anniversary. Thomas was fully in charge now, with Robert and Samuel as his partners. Ruth had married a teacher and moved to Cheyenne, though she visited often. The twins had married as well, both to good men who treated them well, and they lived within a day's ride. Margaret and Russell spent most of their time in the main house now, with a full-time nurse living in to help with the daily tasks that had become more difficult. But they were happy, surrounded by family, watching their legacy continue to grow and flourish. One night in late spring 1926, Russell woke Margaret gently. "Come with me," he whispered. "I want to show you something." She followed him out onto the porch, wrapped in shawls against the cool night air. The sky was ablaze with stars, and the moon was full and bright. "Do you remember the night I proposed to you?" Russell asked, holding her close. "It was a night like this, clear and cold, with stars everywhere." "I remember," Margaret said. "I thought I'd never be that happy again. And were you, happy I mean?" "Every single day," Margaret said firmly. "Even the hard days, even the sad days, I was happy because I had you and our children." That's what happiness is, Russell. It's not the absence of difficulty. It's having someone to face the difficulties with, someone who makes even the hardest days bearable. "You've made every day bearable and more than bearable," Russell said. "You've made my life a joy and an adventure. I hope you know that." "I do," Margaret said, "because you've done the same for me." They stood together under the stars, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that had sustained them through 4 decades. Inside the house, their children slept, and across the ranch, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried on the legacy they'd created. Russell passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1928, at the age of 76. He'd spent the day riding the range with Thomas, checking on the cattle and making plans for spring. He'd eaten a good dinner, played with his great-grandchildren, and kissed Margaret goodnight like he'd done thousands of times before. When she woke the next morning and found him gone, Margaret felt like half of herself had been torn away. But even in her grief, she was grateful. Grateful for every day they'd had together. Grateful that he'd gone peacefully. Grateful that he'd died doing what he loved, surrounded by the family they'd built together. The funeral was one of the largest Wyoming had ever seen. People came from across the state to pay their respects to Russell Lawson, the rancher who'd built an empire on principles of hard work and kindness. They spoke of his integrity, his generosity, his love for his family and his land. But the most moving tribute came from Thomas, who stood before the gathered crowd and spoke of the man who'd chosen to be his father. "Russell Lawson met my mother, my sister, and me when we were desperate and alone," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his tears. "He could have offered us a handout and sent us on our way. Instead, he offered us a home, and then he offered us his heart. He raised us like we were his own blood, loved us unconditionally, and taught us what it meant to be good people. He built this ranch into something remarkable, but his greatest legacy is the family he created and the values he instilled in all of us. We will honor his memory by living the way he taught us to live, with integrity, compassion, and always making room for one more at the table." Margaret lived another 5 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She remained sharp and engaged until the end, telling stories of the old days, sharing the wisdom she'd accumulated over nearly 8 decades of life. She passed away in her sleep in the spring of 1933, just as the prairie was blooming with wildflowers. Her last words to Sarah, who'd come to visit, were, "I've had such a beautiful life. Tell everyone I love them and tell them to remember that family is everything." They buried her next to Russell on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains in the distance and the double L spread out below. The stone reads simply, "Margaret Emerson Lawson, beloved wife and mother, 1861–1933. She made a house a home." But her true memorial was the family she left behind. 7 children, dozens of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all carrying forward the legacy of love and kindness that she and Russell had created. The Double L Ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's stewardship, and eventually his children's, remaining in the family for generations. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the stars were bright and the prairie wind whispered through the grass, people swore they could feel the presence of Russell and Margaret, still watching over the land and the family they'd built together. Still together, even in death, just as they'd promised each other 46 years earlier, when a desperate woman in a wagon met a rancher who promised her a home by sundown and gave her the world instead. The story of their love became a legend in Wyoming, passed down through generations as a reminder that it's never too late to start over, that kindness can change lives, and that love, when it's real and true, can weather any storm and last beyond a lifetime. It was a story of second chances and chosen family, of building something beautiful from the ashes of loss, of 2 people who found each other when they needed it most, and created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone.